Hi, I'd like to ask you a question. Have you ever been forgotten? Maybe as a child, there was an occasion where maybe mom or dad or both of them forgot you for a few moments or misplaced you. I know we had an incident with my own daughter. One time, Cindy and I got confused and we forgot her at the house. And when she was about 8 years old, for just a few minutes, but it seemed like an eternity. Well, this time from Genesis 40 and 41, I'd like to talk to you about if you've ever been felt like you were forgotten by God. Certainly, in the story about Joseph and what we see happening here, that's the first thing we think about is has God forgotten about Joseph and about where he is and why is all of this stuff that's so bad happening to him? If you remember, we left off with him in prison for something that he did not do. And we begin to see in these chapters some other things happening very rapidly in some ways that's going to help us begin to understand why all this is happening. Still, we don't know the full story, but we begin to see some things unfold. And we see already, it's important for us not to go over the fact that Joseph is in a particular prison at the beginning of chapter 40. He is in the king's prison, Pharaoh's prison, for his special prisoners. In other words, people who are in the court or people of high standing. This was a particular prison that Potiphar had put Joseph into. So Joseph is already in the right place. He doesn't know it. And as the reader, we don't know that yet. But now we're beginning to get a sense that God has him right in exactly the right prison that he wants him to be. Because in this prison is where Joseph meets two particular important people. These are people who've also been put there by Pharaoh in his special prison for his people. And it is a cupbearer and a baker. And while they are there, they have dreams. These dreams, it's implied certainly that these dreams are from God. And Joseph is there. And this whole idea of dreams that we saw at the very beginning when Joseph was 17 years old, he's 28 years old now. We see the whole use of dreams now coming full circle back around again. But this cupbearer and this baker both have dreams. The cupbearer dreams of a grapevine that has three branches on it full of grapes, and he takes the grapes and he squeezes them into the cup and he gives the cup to Pharaoh. And Joseph interprets that dream and says the three branches are 3 days, and in 3 days you're going to be restored to your previous position. Your head will be lifted up in the sense of in a good way. You'll be restored and you'll get your life back. The text tells us that the baker hears this good interpretation and then is eager for Joseph to tell him interpretation of his dream. In his dream, he's a baker, so on his head he had 3 baskets that were full of food. But in his dream, the birds were coming and lighting on his head and eating the food. And so Joseph interprets his dream and says, well, the 3 baskets there are 3 days. We see the numbers coming in as consistent. In 3 days' time, you're going to be lifted up too, your head, but not in the same way. The king is going to execute you. And so that's exactly what happens to him. He hangs the baker. So what happens is these dreams come true, and Joseph's, again, God being with Joseph and the ability to interpret dreams is manifested. And he tells the cupbearer, he says, now when you get out of here, remember me. Tell Pharaoh that I am here unjustly. I've been stolen away from my homeland. I've come here as a slave and I've been accused of something that I didn't do. Will you please tell him this? And in this, we see Joseph, even though he seems to be demonstrating great integrity, we still see him as a human person. He wants the Pharaoh to know, who has the power to get him out, to say, I haven't done anything. Would you please look at my case, so to speak? But the last words of that chapter tells us that the cupbearer did not remember him. And so he is forgotten. Chapter 41 begins with these really sad words. It just sort of makes your heart sink if you're reading the Joseph story with fresh eyes or maybe for the first time. It just makes your heart sink because it begins after 2 whole years. And then the story continues. So you're thinking, oh my goodness, the cupbearer forgot him, and it's been 2 more years that Joseph has had to stay in this prison. Now he's in the prison. It doesn't seem to be a hard time. He's actually in charge. The jailers put him in a great deal of charge over the prisoners, but he's still in prison. This is not somewhere he wants to be. He doesn't have his freedom, and he sees no end in sight to all of this. But again, we see that it's just the right timing, because then Pharaoh has dreams, presumably from the Lord. And these dreams are of cows and of grain. And there's a certain similarity between the two dreams. In the first dream, there's 7 healthy, big cows, nice cows, and then these 7 puny, skinny cows that come and devour the healthy ones. And then in the second dream, there's these nice, big, plump 7 heads of grain. And then there's these withered, dried out, scrawny grain that consumes the good ones. And so he's wrestling with these dreams. What could this mean? And then the cupbearer remembers, and they fetch Joseph. They clean him up. they get him presentable to Pharaoh. He comes before Pharaoh, and then he's able to interpret dreams. And he says, well, the 2 dreams are one and the same. The 7 represents 7 years. And very simply, there's going to be 7 years of plenty, where Egypt's going to have plenty of food and harvest. And then there's going to come 7 devastating years of famine. And so he interprets the dream. Now, Joseph does something here that I noticed that is unusual. He gives Pharaoh, unsolicited advice and counsel. He goes from just interpreting the dream to telling him what he needs to do. So he tells him, hey, you need to get ready for this famine that's coming. You need to appoint people to be in charge of food. You need to set up storage places and store 1/5 of the food for 7 years, so you'll be ready for this. And the king says, that's a really good idea. And he says, I know just the guy to put in charge of this, you, Joseph. So he elevates Joseph to the highest ranking position just under Pharaoh himself, and gives him charge over all of this long-range project, food project, storing up the food so that they'll be ready for this famine that is coming. And so just like that, in a moment, after all of that waiting, Joseph's position is dramatically changed from being in the prison. Now he's in the palace, and now he is the most powerful man in the land other than Pharaoh himself. And then at the end of the chapter, we see I guess the best way to say it is the Egyptianizing of Joseph. First of all, they cleaned Joseph up, and by the time we see him later, he looks like an Egyptian with dress of someone of his stature and his position. But we also see some other things that happen. Pharaoh gives him a new name, Zaphaneth-Paneah, and there's some debate about what that actually means, but it's an Egyptian name. He gives him an Egyptian wife, Seneth. And not only is she Egyptian, she is from a really important family, a high priestly pagan family within Egypt. And then the text tells us in chapter 41 that he has 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. So we see this Egyptianizing, this assimilation of Joseph into Egyptian culture. And we don't, we might think, well, now wait a minute, this doesn't seem quite right for a Hebrew to be having an Egyptian pagan wife and then having children that are partly Egyptian, and all of this. And actually, down the road for Jewish rabbis, this was a point of consternation. They wrestled with this. The text, scriptures, they never condemn Joseph for this. It's as if in that time, in that setting, under those circumstances, that this is permissible. There's nothing wrong with it. This is just something that happened to Joseph, and he's doing the best he can where he is in this exile that he personally has. And then it ends with the famine coming. 7 years pass, so now Joseph is up to about 37 years old, and the famine now is setting in on the land, but Egypt is prepared. So in these 2 chapters, we see something that's really important in understanding the Bible, understanding God and our relationship to him. We see throughout the whole story as it's unfolding the hand of God's providence. And when we talk about the providence of God, what we mean is God's superintending of events that aren't supernatural. We're not seeing any miracles here, except you might say Joseph's ability given to God to interpret these dreams, but there's no parting of the Red Seas, there's no healing, there's no supernatural miracles, but we see the hand of God's providence through the whole story. And that's always true. We see that he's in a providential place, which is a prison, the king's prison, so that things can begin to unfold. We see the providential meeting with the cupbearer and able to interpret his dreams. We see providential forgetfulness, that for 2 years the cupbearer forgot, but then just at the right moment, when Joseph was needed and God was going to use his ability to interpret these dreams, then he remembered. There was providential timing with Pharaoh's dreams and bringing Joseph out of the prison at that time. And then this providential opportunity where Joseph even counsels the king about how to get ready for this devastating famine that's coming. And really what's going on is we're being set up for what's even going to happen more providentially. It's even bigger. And that, of course, is Joseph's position to be where he is when all of this famine hits and for the saving of the family of Israel. That's really where all of this is moving. So I just want to encourage all of us that at times when we might feel like God has been forgetful, maybe we're waiting, thinking, when is God going to pull the trigger? Let me just encourage you, when he does, things can happen very quickly. But sometimes it's hard in that waiting period, or if you feel like he's got you in a so-called prison or a place that's undesirable, never forget that God is moving the pieces, and he's moving things that you and I can't see, but he's at work, and he's moving them. And in time, he'll pull the trigger, and things will begin to happen. But in the meantime, he calls upon us to be faithful, to be patient, to always be trusting in his providential care for his children, because he does. So next time, continue to read. We'll be in chapter 42, and we'll continue through our study in Genesis.